Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of The Cloud Whisperers. I am David Broussard.
And I'm Brian Cheatham. And we're back.
And we are back. Yes, today we're going to use a little different format than we've had in the past. We're going to go directly into the content. Today we are talking about, and this is our 48th episode, amazing, Azure B2B connectivity. So let's start, Brian, before we get into what is B2B connectivity. Let's start by kind of defining what the business problem is for Azure, for why we might use this. So a lot of times I talk to organizations and they want to communicate and collaborate with people who aren't members of their organization.
Right.
Now, the communication side, that's email, that's chat, that's pretty simple, right?
Yeah.
But the collaboration side is a little bit more difficult because if I'm going to share documents, if I'm going to share items inside of M365, right, that user has to be known to my Entra ID to be able to be granted access, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So if that's the business problem, how do we solve that? Now, obviously, we're going to talk about Azure B2B connectivity. So, Brian, what the heck is Azure B2B?
Well, so the way I like to think about this, right, is you need access to a resource, right?
Okay.
In a tenant. So we need to have some sort of account for that, right?
Okay.
And the way I think about, I guess maybe a way to explain this would be, okay, let's think about 15 years ago, right? In the old
Okay.
days. How would we do this? Right?
Well,
Like
an
you and I
LDAP.
are contractors.
Yeah, we would do like a, well,
Yeah.
we're assuming, by the way, that we aren't going to want to buy a license for this person and give them an account
Right.
inside of our tenant. But
Right.
in the old days, we could do an LDAP provider, right? Or we could, of course, if it was on premise, we could just add you to the Active Directory. There was no license charge associated.
And that's what would happen, right? So they create what's called a contractor account, right?
Right.
So we had to remember that password.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We had to remember that separate password. It was completely separate. We probably at the time, we probably had like 5 or 6 of them running around town,
5 or 600.
Yeah. And then you've got the admin on that side that needs to support that as well.
Right.
Okay. So you got the password resets and all that sort of stuff. And then what about the revoking access? I can't tell you how many times that I've actually, found a colleague's account that was still enabled in that person's. So extending kind of on the business, defining the business problem, right? I mean, that's really what we're faced with. So what B2B does is it gives us the capability of having external collaborators, right, in our environment with just something as simple as an invite, right? We invite that user.
Okay.
And we think of it as rather than an account that's created for you with a license, with a separate password and all that, right? You're almost like bringing your own identity, right? Bringing your own authentication is what I like to call that. So we invite them to our tenant. That creates a stub or a guest account, right? It's called a guest account. And then from there, that user has the ability to access resources because we gave them an account. Okay.
Gotcha.
And it works very seamlessly with Teams and all the other things too, right? Because if you think about it, when you create a team and you want to invite a guest user to it, by default, you can go in and say, I'm going to invite that guest user that has an external email address or an external domain, right? And what happens behind the scenes with that process is actually Azure B2B. So you may not even know that you're using Azure B2B, right? I mean, that guest account is getting created automatically for you, which, as we talked about before, that could be a security concern too, the default configuration.
Yeah. All right. So there are a couple other things. I've heard of Azure B2C, right? So what's the use of Azure B2C as opposed to Azure B2B?
Yeah. So B2C is really more intended for like commerce, and interacting with consumers. And it's the thing to think about. The only thing I want to say about B2C, because I don't want to muddy the waters around B2B and the differences and all that, right? Mainly those are not an account. It's not an account or anything, a guest account or anything within our tenant, right? It's actually managed in a separate area completely. So we don't have any account associated with that B2C, but typically it's intended for commerce and things like that.
All right. And
Now
then,
your direct connect, with
yeah,
direct connect,
yeah.
yep, it's
Go ahead.
it's more of a it really came about for the Teams shared channel specifically. At the
Okay.
time, people were complaining about having to switch in Teams to the different organizations and all that, right?
Oh, yeah.
So Microsoft's okay, we need to solve this somehow, right? So they came up with the concept of the Teams shared channel, and guess what was born? The Direct Connect. So that's more like a trust, between two Microsoft 365 or Microsoft Entra tenants, right? So
Right.
we both have to be Microsoft on both sides of that to establish that. But that whole thing exists because of the Teams shared channel.
Well,
um,
and I know I was been very excited about shared channels when they came out, and
yeah,
that was like a couple of
everybody
years
was.
ago. I still haven't ever used one.
Yeah,
Not just talking about like, even trying to
can't get
set
it to
one up from
work.
a testing standpoint, I can't get the darn thing to work. So it's not easy to
Yeah,
do.
it's not straightforward.
But B2B, all you have to do is just say, share with this user, and assuming your tenant's configured correctly, boom, it's done for you. All
Yep.
right.
Yep.
So, all that being said, let's talk about how we solve this problem. Okay. So, the assumption here is you're already in Microsoft 365, you're already using things, but now you're going, wait a second, am I configured the right way? Is
Yeah.
my tenant configured in the way that makes sense? So
Yep.
let's take a look at what we've got going on out here. And so, what we're really talking about today are some Entra ID settings. So why don't you, Brian, kind of walk me through the things that I would do. So I go to my Azure portal and I'm going to go to Entra ID, right?
Yep.
Okay. So
And,
once I'm
and you
in,
can also get to this, the Azure Active Directory portal,
uh-huh,
from the admin center too. You can go to the
sure,
admin center in
sure.
365 and at the bottom, right? So
Yeah.
several different ways to get it, but
Okay.
it is a part of Azure. So you go to portal.azure.com and then this will take
Okay.
you to Microsoft Entra. Yep.
And so once I'm here, what am I going to go look at?
And then here, and when you go this way too, just so everybody kind of understands, you're looking at the old grouping they have as far as the menu system is concerned and all that.
Oh,
So it
okay.
looks a little different.
Oh,
They
I
group
guess
them
that's
together a little
down.
bit differently on when you go via like the Microsoft 365 Admin Center.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, if you want to scroll down, you can go to go down to your external.
External identities.
Yep, there you go, external
Okay.
identities. Yep, and
All right.
then the area that we were talking about before, right, is the external collaboration settings.
Okay. All right. And so there's a series of these ones, and the first one is this guest user access. Now, by default, Microsoft puts it right in the middle, which
Yep.
means that they have limited access to properties and memberships of directory objects, as opposed to everything. So internally, you could hover over somebody internally, right? And it gives you all of the information about them, their manager
Yep.
and email and their
You
phone
can see all
numbers.
kinds. You can.
This
Yep.
has
It's
got
another
a
way
little, a little
to
bit, a
gain
little
access
bit
to data.
limited.
Yep.
Okay. Um, but if you want to be safer and you don't want somebody going out and even finding out, other pieces of things like their email addresses of other people, you would probably want to set this down to their
Yeah.
most restrictive setting. That's what I would normally say.
Yep. Yeah.
Um,
You can. Yep. You can
yeah.
definitely do that. Just remember that there is when we get to most restrictive or anything that's most restrictive or something like that,
Mhm.
there is a user impact to that. So you will see some things in Teams.
Okay.
Guests from a guest perspective, right? They're not going to be able to see, names a certain way, display names a certain way in the directory and all that. You'll know when you see it. Just know that if we
Yeah.
do go most restrictive here, we will impact that guest user experience.
Okay. Now the invite settings, it's set on most inclusive, which means that anyone in the organization can invite guest users. But that also means that somebody who's a guest, right?
Yep.
So in other words, if I've invited somebody into my tenant, they're now a guest, they're part of
Yep.
my organization, which means
Yep.
they can invite guests.
So you add them to a
So,
team, they can go in and invite their colleague to the team, right? So yeah, this is
which
this is one of those kind of buried
might,
things that you don't
yeah,
know.
yeah,
Yeah.
and so it's very open and collaborative, but that
Yeah.
might not be what you really want. We might recommend setting it down to here where only people who are members of your tenant, right, will be able to invite people. Now you can
Yep.
get even more restrictive and get it down to only specific admin roles, right?
Yep.
Or you can even set it to where no one can invite guests, including
Yeah.
admins. And then people have to be added manually as guests if you're going to do that one. But we would
Yeah.
say
So
maybe this first level down might be the most
yeah. So if you
appropriate.
set that there, think of it this way, right? I mean, you're closing up that hole that's there where guest users can invite other guests, right? We don't want that
Mhm.
to happen. By setting it here, right, we give the ability for us to have that kind of default experience, right? To where when I go into SharePoint and I share a file or a folder with someone, right,
Mhm.
I can type in their email address and it will create a guest behind the scenes for me, right?
Right.
So I can have that type of experience.
Yeah.
If I want to be more restrictive, I can do
Right.
that in SharePoint, right? I can go into
Yeah.
SharePoint and say, hey, for a particular site, I only want people to be able to, only existing users can actually be invited to collaborate or have access to these files, right? So that would
Yeah.
require, me as an admin to go in, for example, and create that guest account in 365. So
Which
setting
makes
it here like this and then controlling it on the SharePoint side would be the recommendation for sure.
Now, this next one down here, enable guest self-service sign up via user flows. This is allowing us to set up a way. If I click this to yes, it's gonna allow me to configure um, a Power Automate flow that's going to allow people to go through. And so now, when somebody is creating a
Yeah.
guest, it actually go through an approval
I've
process.
actually never used that feature. I never have.
It's actually really cool. You can this is if you want to do it. But there's some great third party tools. I mean, Orchestra does a
Yeah.
great job of giving you
Yeah.
multiple ways of handling approvals and things like that. Okay.
No, I love having the additional new wizard in front of this to guide
Yeah.
people to where they really
Yeah.
need to be and what they,
Now
what
this
they need to be sharing and whatnot.
this next one, external user leave settings. This is saying, can a person who is a guest, can they leave your organization? And because they have that option. And by
Yep.
default, it's set to yes. If you don't want people to leave and thus have to go be re-added later on, you could turn it off. But I think it makes sense just to go ahead and leave
Yeah,
this
I don't
yes.
really know. I can't think of a good reason why I would say no to that. I mean,
Yeah.
honestly, other than causing maybe a little bit of a support snafu, right? Hey, I removed myself.
It could be if for example I've got this set on no one can add or only admins can add,
Yeah,
right? Then this could be a real pain if somebody leaves and now I have to go back to the process of getting them re-added, right?
right. Yep.
So that's the one reason I could see doing that. And then the last one here is if I want to restrict who I can let join as guests, I can let everybody come in, which is the default, or I can blacklist certain domains or I can whitelist certain domains, right? And say, look,
Yep.
I only want people coming in from specific domains, or I don't want people coming from, say, like
Yep.
gmail.com or outlook.com or
Yeah.
something like that. So depending upon your needs there, that can be set up that way. All right.
Yeah. And
So
so, yeah, for that, what I would say basically is, if you want to control that, start with the allow list, right? I mean,
yeah,
that's where you should start.
yep, yep.
It's too much.
Now,
If you're worried about security and all that or whatever, start with the allow list. Don't do the blacklist to yourself.
yeah. Now the other thing we have to take a look at is the all identity providers up here. And so in the all identity providers, Microsoft by default is
Yep.
saying Entra ID is configured. And so that means as another person coming in, if they have an Entra ID account, Microsoft already knows how to talk to them. Hey, it makes perfect sense, right?
Yep.
They also know how to talk to Microsoft accounts. Now, a Microsoft account is a consumer level account, right? It can be tied to an email address. In
Yep.
fact, I have a Microsoft account and an Entra ID account for the same email address, which is always fun. Um, but
You
but
can
that
rename the Microsoft account to where you
I
don't get
can
that
I
problem.
can I know I never have messed with it because I otherwise I'll forget it, right? And it's even more fun because I can tell when I log in sometimes because the
Yeah.
MFA is different for a Microsoft account than it is for an Entra ID account. So I can kind of tell which one is which.
You
Uh,
can always tell when it's the afterthoughts that Microsoft had of these things, right? It's like, oh, we didn't
yes.
think about that. And that they're a developer birthed a screen, a wizard screen that we hate to see.
And then this other one we've got in here is this one-time passcode. Now, this I really like the one-time passcode because,
Yep.
let's say that I want to collaborate with somebody who has a Gmail account, right? But it's not a Gmail account, and the person doesn't want to get a Microsoft account, right?
Yep.
So now what happens is, how can I still talk to somebody who doesn't have an Entra ID and doesn't have a Microsoft account, right? Well, the one-time passcode is great because what happens is when I go to access something, Microsoft sends an email with a access code inside of it, and then they type that number into the web page, right?
Yep.
So we know it's almost like you're used to an MFA with an SMTP password. It's the same thing, only it's coming to your email,
Yeah.
right? And every time they reaccess, it's going to force that one-time passcode to be configured again. If you
Yep.
really want to, and you want to let people use Google accounts or Facebook accounts, you can configure those and get those set up as well, right?
Yeah, it's funny that the default experience used to be the Microsoft account. Remember how painful the guest experience was? It was because of
Hmm.
that, and
Yeah.
Microsoft switched to the one-time passcode. So I'll say this, right?
Hmm.
In the security world, right? One-time passcode and SMS texts and things like that, or whatever, those are becoming a no-no, right? I mean, we
Yeah.
need to stay away
Yeah.
from those sort of things as the only way, or even in a second factor type of scenario, right? Because we've got eavesdroppers everywhere now. We got people
Right.
all over the Verizon network, got people all over AT&T network, and bad people, right? So
Yep.
what I always tell people is part of the Entra configuration is to consider enabling MFA for the guests. So we actually have conditional access policies specifically for guests, right, that require MFA. And it's good to separate out those conditional access policies for the guest users, because with our regular users, when we're using MFA, require MFA and all that, we also have other access controls like, hey, I want to be on a compliant device. So a guest user not going to be on a compliant device, right? Because we don't manage
Right.
that thing. So creating a separate policy for that. But the point of that is, for that one-time passcode, I highly encourage you to think about enabling MFA for those guest users as well. So when they sign in with that one-time passcode for the first time, they're going to be prompted to register for MFA in your tenant. So they're
Yep.
going to set up Authenticator on their mobile app. They're going to have to go through that process. Now, it'll take them 20 minutes to do that, and they'll probably bang their head against the phone a couple of times to get there. But once they have that set, you now have a much more secure method for a guest user to come into your environment. I do this all the time for
Right.
people that just need access to, hey, I have this external contractor, and they
Hmm.
just need access to this folder in SharePoint. It's exactly what I do. I don't give them access to Teams. I don't do any of that stuff. I
Yep.
create a new guest user. I send them the invite to that particular email address, or have them send them the invite or
Hmm.
share the file, right? And then when they go and click the link for SharePoint for that file, the link, the shareable link, they get prompted for the one-time passcode, and then they go through the register for MFA process. And then after that, every time they use that moving forward, they're going to get an MFA prompt. So
Yeah, which is I mean, that's a great way of doing it, because now what happens is and I would do that even if they were using a Microsoft account or an Entra ID account. I
yep,
still want to make sure. So even though somebody's using Entra ID, right,
yeah,
or Microsoft account, I still want to make sure that person has set up MFA when they access my stuff, because my stuff is still important, and
yeah.
I
So
really don't want them.
authentication,
Yeah,
the password, the authentication, the first level of authentication happens
yeah,
in the source, right, or where that guest is coming from, where they live, right, from an identity perspective,
yeah,
and
and
then
and
it
if
can
you're doing
require
business in
MFA on your
California.
side.
Yeah,
What's
and
that?
if you're doing business in California, they require that MFA, right?
Yep.
Or you're not using best practices of security, and that means you could be liable under certain circumstances.
Yeah.
Okay.
So in that scenario, just closing that loop, right?
Yep.
The authentication, the initial authentication happens in the source identity provider. Like, say, for example, in this case, it came from Microsoft Entra. And
Hmm.
then the MFA requirement comes from your tenant where the guest
Right.
exists. Yep.
Yep. Yeah, and hey, that sounds like a great future episode for us to go through how to configure that
It
stuff.
gets
Right.
pretty
It does.
complicated when you're doing Entra ID to Entra ID, because if they've already satisfied MFA on the source side, there's some exceptions there and all that too. So we can definitely cover that in a
Hey,
future.
I've I have had a few situations where I've logged into some place and I've had two MFAs hit me, right?
Yeah.
One was my tenant doing an MFA, and then the other
Yep.
one was their tenant doing the MFA, right? And I'm like,
Microsoft has some logic there, so they're trying to get better at it, right?
yeah, it's okay. Hey, lastly, there's this custom tab over here. If you are going to use something like what Okta or another
Yep.
third-party provider, Open ID or something like that,
On-prem, yeah, it could be an on-prem
yeah.
IDP, right?
Yeah,
So
yeah, exactly. You can go ahead and set them up inside of here as well. But the main thing is this is designed to give you an idea of, how really the first few settings are pretty straightforward. And we wanted to give you a quick understanding of how you can quickly go out there and fix your tenant so that you're taking the basic levels of security. And in future episodes, we'll go much deeper into some of these different things. So, hey, Brian, that was a fun
hey,
new
David.
episode, right?
Yes, it was.
I kind of enjoyed this process. Was a little bit deeper technically and the like. So we'll look for talking to you again soon about one of our other topics that we've got out there.
Absolutely great to be back.
Yeah. All right. Hey, everybody. You down at the bottom, we've had the scroll. Check us out on YouTube. You'll find this video there. We're going to be the audio part will be out on the podcasts. We've got a website. It's coming. It's there. It's just we don't have much content out there yet. Cloudwhisperers.net. Expect to add more content in the near future, but I've been saying that for a while. As always, we're on SoundCloud. That's our primary place to go find us. But Brian, it's been as they say on one of my favorite podcasts, it's been a banger of an episode.
Good
You
stuff,
have a
David.
good
Take
one. Take
You
care.
too.